Although Brian Moser wasn't the focus of Dexter's original sin, he is definitely the highlight of the season. And since we got more insight into his backstory, what better time is there to discuss whether Biney is a monster or a victim? Today, I want to act as a spiritual lawyer and go over why I know Brian Moser did nothing wrong. After the death of Laura Moser, we find out Harry actually tried to take care of Dexter and Brian. Unfortunately, this was short-lived due to Brian developing violent tendencies. He was affected by the loss of his mother differently to his brother, and the Morgans couldn't handle that type of trauma, so it was settled. The brothers would be separated, and Brian would have to find a new home. First, Brian is taken to the Kirsten family, who seem happy for his arrival, but their son Blake isn't. One night, when the two children are walking together, Blake locks Brian in a closet, refusing to let him out. This triggers Brian's PTSD from when he was locked inside the shipping container, and by the time Mrs. Kirsten retrieved Brian, he attacked her. Since the household wasn't the right fit, next Brian is taken to a group home. At the dinner table one evening, the oldest boy, Felix Woodard, reaches over for Brian's plate and starts to empty it onto his own. In response, Brian grabs a fork and sticks it into Felix's hand. Because of this action, Brian is sent to his final destination, the Harbour Light Mental Hospital, and here he is diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. Some doctors even called him a psychopath. When Brian was 18, a worker at the hospital named Raul Martinez was accused of stealing Biney's meds. This was in fact true, and not only was he stealing the new medication Brian should have been on for at least 6 months to get better, he was pawning them. Eventually, Brian was discharged from the hospital, but still had a therapist to speak to, Dr. Paul Petrie, who was very proud of Brian for being able to speak about his past without getting triggered, but still won't allow Brian to see Dexter. He believes interacting with his brother will trigger Brian's trauma, but funny enough, this decision is what triggers Brian into killing him. The sole reason Brian wanted to get better was to be able to see his brother, and even now he still can't. So he decides to find and make contact with Dexter, doing whatever it takes. Setting out to find his brother, we can actually see Brian at Dexter's first crime scene in the background. We also find out later that the victim at the scene is Raul, and was of course killed by Biney. Later that day, Brian follows Dexter to a restaurant and sees him at a table alone. He approaches him and asks, "Anyone sitting here?" To which Dex replies, "Yeah, I'm saving these seats for my friends." Although this was true, the heartbreaking reality is Dexter forgot about Brian. For the past 17 years, the only thing that was on Brian's mind was getting back to his brother, to the point doctors described him as being fixated on Dexter. When he finally finds and makes contact with Dex, he isn't even remembered and is treated as a stranger. The justice system stole Brian from his brother, and it only makes sense in these circumstances why he would want revenge. Not to mention, while and after trying to get better at the hospital, he was constantly told that he wasn't allowed to see Dexter, which I believe is pretty unrealistic. The excuse Dr. Paul Petrie uses to why Brian can't see Dexter is flawed, even though I'm not a therapist. Yes, of course, Brian would remember the events that happened to him and would get some sort of PTSD reaction, but on the other hand, seeing his little brother sooner would have given him hope. What I find complex is how important Harry becomes in this situation. On one hand, you could argue Harry did the right thing and was just protecting Dexter by not telling him about Brian. His reasoning for separating the two was the way the trauma affected Brian compared to Dexter. Brian was old enough to remember, and it's made quite obvious Dexter isn't. Although both brothers become serial killers, I think what prompted Harry to not tell his son about Brian was to not further his darkness. Already, Harry lies to Dexter and tells him that he was born with dark urges, so imagine Dex meeting his brother who knows the truth and has the same urges. Maybe a younger Dexter would have been persuaded by Brian to drop the code and would have felt a huge amount of betrayal. Essentially, protecting Dexter from Brian ensures his urges stay at bay, he doesn't remember his past, and he doesn't get caught. Who knows how much his brother would have influenced him. On the other hand, Harry keeping Dex away from Biney actually indirectly causes the events of season 1. Stay with me for a sec. The main motive of the eye struck killer is to make Dexter remember his past. In doing so, countless people suffer and Deborah Morgan almost dies. This is a massive reach by me, but ask yourself, if Brian was allowed to see Dex at any time between or after treatment, would season 1 of the original series exist? I'm not saying Brian Moser would have been an innocent civilian, but his main twisted motive stems from his brother being taken from him by Harry Morgan. Less of a reach is the simple fact that Harry keeping Dexter away from Brian is wrong because it led Dexter to believe he was on his own. We see throughout the original series that Dexter seeks deep connections with people and can't connect because if he showed who he really was, no one could ever love him. Despite later in the show, we see that's not entirely true. For 30 years, he didn't even know he had a brother, someone who could not only relate to him, but would fully accept the real him. Not to mention, he had to kill his blood brother for his foster sister to honor the code, and he knew it was the hard but right choice to make. If you've forgotten, not only did this event change Deb forever, but it changed Dexter too. He was betrayed by his father and didn't know his past or his brother for decades. And when he finally finds out, he has to kill the only person in the world that understands him. This is the reason why I think ultimately Harry keeping the truth from Dex has more cons than pros and does more harm than good. If Dexter knew the truth or even knew he had a brother, who knows how many innocents would have been saved. But I'll leave this debate for you guys to decide and tell me what the right choice was. To defend Brian fully, we need to see if his kills in Original Sin are justified or at least understandable. The first victim was Biney's therapist, Dr. Paul Petrie. What I find stupid about Paul is the fact that he understands Brian's backstory, his goals, and what sets him off. Yet, the way he tries to stop Brian from pressing to see Dexter is to threaten to put him back in the hospital he's been in since he was 7. Although as the viewer we know who Brian is, that does not excuse the fact that Paul's choice in words are dumb. Not to mention, the system could have easily made a way for Brian to see Dex even if they were supervised. To tell someone whose goal is to get better to see their brother that they can't ever see their brother is crazy. This isn't a hard kill to understand or justify. The second victim is Raul Martinez. Victim 3, Blake Kirsten, is a debatable one. For one, he was a kid who didn't know any better, but at the same time what he did was at the wrong time. My guess is Blake didn't want his parents to focus on Brian and was scared of getting less attention. That, or he was a little wretch. He probably didn't know Brian's backstory, so I wouldn't call him evil. Blake didn't deserve to die for what he did as a kid, but it is still understandable for the damage he did to Brian at that stage in his life. The same could be said for Felix Woodard, and this kill is so petty it makes me laugh. We don't know if Felix bullied Biney, but since we only get one scene, I'd say this isn't enough to be removed from the earth. Finally, our last but most interesting victim is Barb, the social worker that separated Brian and Dexter. To be honest, Barb was doing her job and what she thought was best for Brian. I believe the hospital was a good place for him, and the wrong that happens to Brian isn't her fault. However, it is very understandable why he would target her, since she was the icing on the cake to why him and his brother were separated. When looking at the case of Brian Moser, it isn't so black and white. After understanding his mother's death, losing his brother, and the corruption he faced in the system, Biney had every right to become the villain. Not to mention, his time in the institution led him to believe having common morals were wrong. Why should he and his brother be imprisoned by a code instead of being free? They deserve it for the cards they've been dealt. Brian Moser is definitely a victim that later becomes a tragic monster, and I think his actions in the early days can be justified. If you would like to hear me question Biney's actions in the original series, please show this video some love and consider subscribing. It may seem small to you, but it means the world to me. Have a blessed day.